This extraordinary presidential race stokes a nationwide debate on immigration, Obamacare, the Supreme Court, and more. A roundtable of our U.S. representatives tackles it all this morning. Today is Sunday, March 13th, 2016, and this is Flashpoint. Hi, welcome to Flashpoint. If you're wondering why we are on so early this morning, you may have forgotten to set your clocks ahead last night. Welcome to daylight savings time, which fortunately means spring can't be too far away. Quite a week on the political front for Michigan. Michigan's leaders spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to make the Michigan primary matter. Well, last Tuesday there was no doubt about where the focus of the political world was. The statistician par excellence Nate Silver said the polls gave Hillary Clinton a 99% chance of winning the Michigan primary. As the saying goes, that's why they play the game. And one of the most shocking primary upsets in memory, Bernie Sanders took the state of Michigan, leaving a lot of Hillary Clinton strategists and quite a few pollsters asking, what just happened? We'll have to wait until this Tuesday's round of primaries to see if Michigan is some kind of outlier or a fortune teller on where the race is headed. But the debates, the speeches, the rallies, they have all helped bring a long list of issues into the spotlight. Immigration, ISIS, Obamacare, tax policy, the influence of Wall Street. They not only help us laser in on a candidate's fitness for the Oval Office, they also point to the battles ahead for whoever wins, because the White House is a powerful pulpit, but it is not a magic wand. What do these debates and these issues tell us about America in 2016? This morning, 4 members of Congress who serve Michigan together and raring to go on those issues today on Flashpoint. It is not an easy thing to get 4 members of Congress together at once, other than for, say, a session of Congress, but their schedules have allowed just such a gathering today, and I'm very grateful. Good to have with me this morning Democratic Congresswoman Brenda Lawrence from Michigan's 14th District. Next to her, Republican Congresswoman Candice Miller from the 10th District. Congresswoman Debbie Dingell, Democrat from the 12th District, is here, and Republican from the 11th District, Dave Trott, is with us. Thank you all very much. I'm delighted that this has worked out. But before we get into this long list of issues I'd like us to discuss this morning, let's recap a little bit about what we think we learned about Michigan and the electorate on Tuesday night. Congresswoman Dingell, I said that it was a shocking result. I'm not sure you were shocked that Bernie Sanders pulled things out. You felt a surge coming, but why did everybody miss that?
Well, as you know, I had been telling people for several weeks it was tighter in Michigan than anybody thought that it was. I think it's a lesson in polling, which I've been making a point for some time, that the assumptions that pollsters put into polls greatly determine what the outcome is. Yeah. And I think what bothers me more than anything, a poll is a poll. It's not a vote, and sometimes the momentum or false information drives both money and momentum. Sure. But the reality is that Secretary of State Clinton didn't turn her attention to Michigan until that last week. Limited time, she focused on Detroit and Flint and not statewide. Senator Saunders came into the state earlier and campaigned everywhere, including Detroit and Flint, and I think ultimately at the end that's what impacted it. The other thing is that I know where she stands on the TPP trade, but I think that she probably could have been stronger in getting her message out on that as well.
Congresswoman Lawrence, a lot of people are baffled as to why somebody that has the political resume that Hillary Clinton has is struggling with a self-avowed socialist who's promising to raise taxes. What do you suppose is going on here?
There is this real, between Trump and Bernie Sanders, there's this real awakening of an electorate that aren't usually engaged in the political process, who feels that for some reason the anti-establishment message is being carried through these 2 candidates. And so there's a lot of things that happen. You know, clearly we could have touched more voters, but there's also the polling that does not poll young people. And the polling
doesn't trust that they're going to get to the polls after they tell you what they're feeling.
So they showed up.
Yeah.
And so did we get where we thought we were going to get? Yes. But did we get what showed up? No. And so it's going to be a challenge for the candidate I support, Hillary Clinton, to make her message stronger and resonate to a larger group that she's pretty much saying the same thing that Bernie is saying, but they're more excited about Bernie.
Over on the other side of things, Congressman Miller, in our Flashpoint, primetime Flashpoint of last week, you said that you would support Donald Trump if he ends up being the nominee. What did his win in Michigan tell you?
You know, it's interesting that Debbie Dingell was talking about trade on your side. Actually, I think on our side, too, on the Republican side. I think that was Trump's message that was really resonating because, of course, he was talking about the border and building the wall and everything, but this is Auto Town here, right, the Motor City. And when he talked about currency manipulation, the other candidates, none of them were talking about that. When he talked about trade and some of these bad trade deals, and you see a county like Macomb County, the home of the Reagan Democrats, where we've had lost so many manufacturing jobs, and I mean, he took half of the vote in Macomb County. Actually, in my entire congressional district, he took 49%. Really an amazing thing. And of course, as a former Secretary of State, I was delighted to see this huge turnout.
Yes,
2.5 million people, and it was the young people coming on for Bernie, feeling the burn over there. And I'll tell you, on our side as well, it was a lot of disaffected Democrats were voting for Trump. And if he is the nominee, I predict that's going to happen again in November.
We have a very engaged electorate. There's no doubt about that. It is interesting, Congressman Trott, but there is as much, some people have started to point out there's a surprising overlap between the Sanders and Trump campaigns.
Yeah, it's, you know, you talk to people and they say I'm either going to vote for Trump or Sanders, and you know, I don't agree with what Trump says, but he's telling me the truth, and I think I agree with Brenda. You know, the election last week, it was an awakening of sorts. You know, record turnout. I think people are motivated by fear and anger, and I think there are people that are very concerned about the path our country's on. I think some people are very angry about the fact that Washington doesn't seem to get the job done. And so I think that's the reason. And
of course, they're talking about you. You're
well, I think everyone likes me, but you know, the other people. And by the way, it's wonderful to be with you today with the wonderful women of the Michigan delegation here. But I think I've kind of stopped predicting. You know, I can see a scenario where Trump's our nominee. I can see a scenario where Paul Ryan's our nominee. I can see a scenario where Joe Biden is the Democratic nominee if Hillary has problems with the Justice Department. I can see a scenario where we call 94-year-old Bob Dole back from 20 years ago and put him in. You know, it's hard to predict how this plays out, really.
Can you get your arms around supporting Donald Trump if he's the nominee? You would support him?
I'm going to support our nominee, and you know, the debate last week, we saw a different Donald Trump. I don't know if he was sedated or what, but he certainly was much more calm in terms of his approach and his demeanor. He actually had some details around some of his solutions, which was the first time he had any, you know, discussion points other than just bravado. So my hope is, as the election progresses, if he's our nominee, that he'll continue to be more substantive in his discussions.
He's still a guy, though, who talks about waterboarding. He's talked about, in very inflammatory terms, about the Muslim population. Are there not things that really concern you about what Donald Trump has said on the campaign trail?
Yes, I think some of the things he has said is a bit over the top. I do think that. On the other hand, as has been said, he says things that a lot of people are thinking about, but you could never say, right? And I think people have looked at Washington and said, my gosh, you just can't get anything done there, and we need to have somebody who's not afraid to take on whoever it is. And look, this guy has taken on the Pope. He's taken, you know, he's taken on the media. He's taken on the establishment. He's taken on Wall Street. You name it, he's taken them on. And
it's never a bad idea to take on the media. I don't know about the Pope. That was an interesting choice.
What you'd hope if Trump got to the Oval Office, he'd do two things. He'd surround himself with some good people, and he would understand that every word he utters is dissected. And so he can't go out and make statements that is going to cause North Korea to do something crazy. And he needs to temper his comments and his bombastic rhetoric if he's president.
But none of that
he
seems
already
to hurt
knows that.
Well, none of that seems to hurt him so far.
Well, I mean, one of the things that did bother me, with all due respect to both of you, because I do have a great deal of respect for you, is when you take the two debates that occurred in Michigan, which was very good for Michigan to have two debates of that quality. But on the stage in Flint, when that occurred, we had two candidates that discussed the issues. They got in depth. You saw them. We talked about a lot of Michigan issues. Then when they were on the stage in Detroit at Fox, we talked more about the male anatomy than we did any Michigan issue, and the word autos never came up. That has to bother you a little.
I want to add, too, you know, the elephant in the room is that punching of an African-American at the debate. Now, he has said over and over in his rallies, punch him in the face, get him out of here. it's okay if you go to jail, I'll represent you. His words mean something. And you know, to laugh them off or to say they're not relevant, when you demean someone because of their religion, when you make these overly racial comments about a population, to me that's not forgivable. If you're going to be the leader of this country and pull everyone together, that's unacceptable.
Let me get to a quick break. We'll continue with that because I'm curious as to what folks in Dearborn, in your home district, are thinking as they're watching this election take place. This is Flashpoint on Local 4. We'll be right back with more in just a minute. Welcome back, Flashpoint, and my congressional roundtable this morning. Congresswoman Dingell, we've had an awful lot of discussion, in fact, the other night in the debate, the way that the Islamic world is responding, not just to America, but to the way that this campaign's playing out. You represent the folks of Dearborn. What are they seeing? What are you hearing as they watch this debate go through?
They're scared. I never thought that we would see the day and age again that we would start to target people because of nationality or religion. And I've said this before and I'm going to say it again. 9/11 was one of the worst times in the history of this country. But we also pulled together. We knew what it meant to be American. We believed in freedom of religion, freedom of speech, and we were going to make sure there was no backlash on the Arab American community or the Muslim community. You come to my district, people are scared. You saw last Thursday night someone tried to break into the Arab American News. The people inside were terrified. We're terrified. And there are, I mean, over the weekend, I listened to people all weekend again articulate that they're worried that a Kalamazoo could happen in Dearborn. They're alert, they're scared. We have to make sure that we protect and remember we're all one community.
Congresswoman Miller, how do we go forward with this? Obviously, ISIS is among most people's top 3 or 4 concerns about what's going on in the world right now. How do we fight this battle without becoming more like what we're fighting?
Well, listen, we live in a very free and open society, and as you know, I'm the Vice Chairman of Homeland Security, and we need to be doing different kinds of things to make sure that we keep our country safe. You're talking about Kalamazoo. Well, that wasn't, I mean, that was a domestic terrorist, you could say, but I mean, look, San Bernardino, you see these there will be others. There just will be, but we have stopped so many. So we have to do all kinds of things to keep ourselves safe here, whether it's the way that we travel, whether we have to be aware of our situational awareness of our environment all the time when we're around. We also have to make sure that we feel we have excellent relations, which we do in Southeast Michigan, with the imams, etc., so that if they are aware in a mosque that some individual has gone to Yemen for 3 weeks or 3 months and they come back, that they feel comfortable about talking about that there's a possibility you have somebody who's been radicalized. It is happening.
And that's how it happened. If you saw what happened with the young man, the family, and the imams worked together.
Should we keep Guantanamo open?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I have been there.
I have too.
And I feel...
You reached the same conclusion? I don't think you did. Did you?
You think they should close it? I'll tell you what.
I would tell you
where are you going to put these individuals? And they are the worst of the worst.
I'm one of the few that believe we should keep it open.
Oh, you do?
Very good.
Yes.
Congressman Dingell?
I have very mixed feelings. So I'm going to kind of see where the dialogue all goes. I respect both of them.
Congressman Trott.
Well, Gitmo's got to stay open because the president signed legislation in December where he agreed under the Defense Reauthorization Act that he would keep it open. So now he's trying to circumvent that. He sent a message to us saying he's going to close it. There are no details around his plan. It's going to cost $500 million. We have no idea where these folks are going to go. And, you know, while the president on his farewell tour is focused on closing Gitmo, he still won't call what ISIS is doing a genocide to the Christians in the Middle East. He still won't call the Muslim Brotherhood a terrorist organization. We need to focus on problems that are a much more significant threat to our nation
But what needs to happen? What needs to happen is that we need to fix the legal system that we have in addressing, because these individuals have not been charged with anything. We need to charge them, do what we need to do, send them back if we want to. I mean, if we determine that's the proper thing to do. But as it stands now, just moving the prisoners into American soil, I'm not supportive of that. But I am in support of, we are spending millions and millions of dollars in legal fees that we do not have our arms around that. We need to correct that.
It's less than 100 detainees now.
Yes, it is.
Several hundred have been released already. One of them showed up recently in Spain, was planning an attack in Spain, was arrested there. So
should we be waterboarding these detainees?
Well, it's interesting. In the debate last week down in Miami, you know, Trump was challenged on that because basically the military, after I think the Detroit debate, said they wouldn't, you know, follow the president's orders because it's against the law, waterboarding. It would be very interesting to get a sense of where Americans are at with respect to Trump's proposal to change the law so as to allow waterboarding. I'm not advocating for waterboarding, but what Trump says about people's fear, about our timid response to the terrorist activities around the world, and sitting there watching 21 people in Libya having their heads chopped off, you know, 21 Coptic Christians. I think most Americans feel like our interrogation tactics are not up to snuff and are not responsive to what's happening in the world.
It's not only that, it's the rules of engagement that our troops are brave men and women when they're in theater, and they have to be so careful about, you know, you can't launch your armaments here because they're concerned that there's wherever they are, that there's going to be collateral damage with civilians and that. Of course, these cowards, these terrorists, they find themselves in schools or churches or hospitals or whatever. The rules of engagements have really are really handicapping our.
Understood, but if we allow the enemy to set the rules of engagement, from what we saw this past week, that means, I guess, that chemical weapons are on the table.
Well, look, we certainly don't want to be going there. On the other hand, we have to be aware that this is not like you know, something that happened where here's the enemy, they all have on the same colored uniform, they're very easy to identify. No, it's a different kind of a battlefield. The battlefield now, particularly with ISIS and that, they see the battlefield asymmetrically in a different way. I mean, the battlefield for the shoe bomber was on a Northwest flight, right? Seat 19A. That was his battlefield. So it is a different configuration that we're looking at.
And the battlefield is going to become more over here. We have been very lucky to not had as many incidences as we've had. And I think we've got to start to have a more open dialogue with everybody in our community about how you protect privacy, how we keep a strong intelligence system. You know, we love to badmouth them, but we need that intelligence system. There are so many events that have been prevented we can never talk to, and we never do anything like that. But then again, how do you talk about a no-fly list, and how does somebody get on it, and how do you get yourself off of it? It's very complicated.
I want to be on the record. I don't support waterboarding. I do not feel something we would not want to happen to our captives that we feel that we're empowered to do. So no, I don't support that.
I'd like us to move to Flint and its applications to broader questions about what we're going to do about infrastructure in America. Congressman Trott, there are a lot of people who fear that as bad as Flint has been, it's the old canary in the coal mine, that we've got a lot of problems that need addressing in a lot of cities, a lot of communities all across America. Where is the will going to come from? Because it's not going to be free.
No, it's going to be very expensive, and I think that's partly why people have some anxiety about where our country's at. And you know, Candice introduced a bill to do a supplemental appropriations to deal with the problem in Flint. And one of the things I heard is a lot of communities would similarly like an appropriation to deal with the problem.
Right.
And but I think we've got to get, you know, some better economic growth in this country, and I think we have to make sure we're spending our money wisely and to address our infrastructure problems. It's going to take a long time to address, though.
It's going to be harder, Congresswoman Miller, to find a community that doesn't want an appropriation for improving infrastructure.
The truth is, you know, I sit on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, and just because it's underground and we don't see it doesn't mean that it's not deteriorating and that it really is going to have an impact on our quality of life. And so it is very important. I mean, I see even in my own county, of course, what's happening in Flint is beyond, it's just terrible. But even in Macomb County, we have all these combined sewer overflows because of inadequate underground infrastructure. And so that's happening in the Clinton River and beach closures. We've seen it all over the Great Lakes area here. These are all things, again, actually, and I didn't endorse Trump. I'm just saying he was talking about transportation. He was saying we're building infrastructure in Afghanistan, and yet we have lead lines all over our country, and so we really do need to.
It's all going to cost an awful lot of money, and where does that come from?
Maybe by not being the world's policeman and providing. I'll tell you, with NATO, in my opinion, needs to buck up. I mean, it was part of NATO is that all of the NATO allies are supposed to spend 2.3, I think, a percentage of their GDP on protecting themselves. Well, none of them do that. Why should they? We protect everyone.
We've got to invest in infrastructure. We finally passed a highway bill, which we all voted for, I think, last December, but we've got to invest more money. And the fact of the matter is, when you do, I do agree with you, and you know that I've been very worried that we're not putting a do not touch Michigan sign. We need to be open for business. We do have know-how, and we need to bring business here because they create jobs. When you invest in infrastructure, you create jobs, and that needs to become a priority for this country because there are 153,000 water systems in this country, and we have to make sure what happened in Flint never happens in another one again.
As I head to the break, we'll whip it around really quick. Should Governor Snyder resign over this?
Governor Snyder should be held accountable, and we have to prioritize our water infrastructure because it's a basic human need. It's not a pothole, and I strongly support and have introduced legislation to do that.
Should he resign?
No, I don't think he should resign.
No, let's get the facts and hold whoever accountable.
There's a failure of government at every level. The governor shouldn't resign. If he has to resign, there's a lot of other people that should resign
He should be held accountable.
Quick break. More after this on Flashpoint. Welcome back to Flashpoint. Quickly running out of time. Congresswoman Lawrence, interesting, all of the candidates have talked about changing Obamacare in one way or another. Congressman Sanders wants to talk about single-payer universal care. Candidates over on the Republican side want to do away with the whole thing. What's the way forward with Obamacare?
We absolutely should not do away with the Affordable Health Care Act or Obamacare. There are some unintended consequences that we must address. We must fix it. We have had a history in our country of civil rights and other issues where it wasn't right in the first pass, and we continue to work on it to address those issues. Let's be a body that the people respond to the people's need, address those concerns, because we should have affordable health care in our country.
Congressman Trott, do you see the right thing to replace it with?
Well, we have to come up with a better solution. You know, I hear from small businesses every day that can't afford Obamacare. I hear from people every day they're annoyed that the federal government has inserted itself in the doctor-patient relationship.
But they've also gotten attached to parts of it, right?
It's going to be hard
Keeping
to just
kids on longer.
Well, the
conditions.
Republican plan had those two aspects, so we had that covered under our plan. But to dismantle Obamacare is going to be very difficult. But we cannot entrust the federal government to run our health care system. They're not competent to do it. They'll bankrupt our country, and people will not get the patient care that they need. It's that simple. So the federal government's not the solution.
Congresswoman?
I agree with Congressman Trott, and actually the Congressional Budget Office has estimated that it's going to be Obamacare in its current form. It's going to cost 2.5 million jobs.
But
so
Bernie Sanders, though, says
killer.
we're the only country in the world that doesn't seem to view health care as a right. That seems to be gaining traction, especially with young people. Does that not ring anything?
I do think that, look, I think that we need to repeal Obamacare, but I do think we need to replace it. And as Dave Trott was just saying, a number of the things that the Republicans are talking about are somewhat similar, but in a cost-effective way, in a way that patients can access and get the federal government out of everybody's doctors.
I want to work with everybody here to address prescription drug costs, which I think all of us agree are too high. The last perfect bill that was passed was the 10 Commandments. In today's day and age, don't know anybody would think that is. Let's work together to improve what's on the way and take care of everybody.
Different kind of tablets, was it? Thank you all very much for being here. I appreciate it. A quick note about Tuesday. It is our Flint Water Crisis for Our Families telethon. Statewide telethon, 5 TV stations and Art Van Furniture helping us out. I hope you'll help us out as well. Meet the Press is coming up next. Have a great week, and we'll see you next time right back here for Flashpoint.